program for graduate students that's taught at a variety of campuses, including UMES, where I taught. And they are sort of run out of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science at Horn Point. It's a popular place. I like to take students to see the oyster hatchery up there. So I'm going to try sharing my program here, and it's going to take a couple of seconds to get this going. That one. And I have to put it in display mode. And come on. Then it's going to look funny until I tell it how to display itself. The horseshoe crab, a keystone species. The term keystone species is an ecological term that defines a species that sort of holds an ecosystem together. And while horseshoe crabs don't actually do that, they are a keystone in a socio-ecological system that involves all these things in this picture: the crab, the birds, the conch shell, and the blood. That's all part of this system. So I like to say that horseshoe crabs are an uncrab. They're not really a crab. The American horseshoe crab, which we call Limulus polyphemus, is really more closely related to spiders than crabs, and I'll explain that in a moment. It lives in shorelines and estuaries everywhere from Maine to Mexico, and females are typically larger than the males. Here are some pictures with a male on the top, and they have these things called pedipalps. Notice that the female on the bottom, her pedipalps are the same on all her legs, but the male on the first leg, his pedipalps are curled over like a little boxing glove, and that's so he can hold on to the female during mating. So this is a complicated list, but it just kind of shows where the horseshoe crabs fit into classification system. If we start at the bottom, we see insects, and then above them crustaceans. That's where the true crabs are, with shrimps and lobsters. And then above them, centipedes and millipedes, those creepy crawly things. If we go left, we're going to a little bit of a higher organization. And then up at the top is a group called the Chelicerata, which includes arachnida. Those are the spiders, over 100,000 species, and the Xiphoschura, which are the horseshoe crabs that are only 4 species. So they're really more closely related to spiders than they are to real crabs. The 4 species include the American horseshoe crab, Limulus polyphemus, and 3 Asian species, Tachypleus and Carcinoscorpius. So this is a place called Skimmer Island. It's actually the same background that I'm using here. And this is a dredge spoil island in the coastal bays of Maryland. And this is one place where horseshoe crabs come to spawn. I went there on an evening a few years ago with one of the state wildlife biologists who was counting crabs on the shoreline. We may see people from Delaware doing that when we go out on our field trip. They do that on some of those weeknights as well. So when we came ashore on this island, we could see a few crabs in the surf there, but when we got closer, they were so thick we couldn't even get to shore. We had to sort of walk across horseshoe crabs to get on shore, and these have come ashore to spawn. They typically do it at high tide at night on the highest tides in the spring. So that occurs about 2 weeks apart over a period of time from May through June. Typically, the May high tide series, we see more horseshoe crabs spawning. So here we see males and females sort of all mixed together. Typically, the bigger ones, the ones on the bottom, are the females, and the males will come up behind them and hook onto the back. You can see the female has barnacles and little slipper shells attached to her. She has not shed her shell for a long time, so they're attached to her. And the male has a couple, but his shell isn't as old as hers. And he will hold on to her until she releases her eggs, and then he will release the sperm that will fertilize those eggs, and she will bury them in the sediment. And we may see a female with 3 or 4 different males sort of tagging on behind her. And when she's done, she will go off into the surf and swim back into the water. The female will do this maybe multiple nights during the high tide series, and then may come back again several weeks later. Over a season, they can release close to 100,000 eggs per female. Here I have a pair that I've turned over. You can see on the right is the female, and she's got the first pair of pedipalps there. Looks normal. You can't see the males. He's using his to hold on to her, and he's also got his appendages wrapped around her tail there. So here they are, all lined up on the shoreline waiting to spawn. And on this particular evening, one of the state biologists, Steve Doctor, was counting horseshoe crabs, and he did this by laying down a little PVC square at intervals and literally counting the crabs in the square. This is about the most I've ever seen. There were probably 25 crabs per square meter at this location. And at the same time, there was another volunteer who was tagging these crabs, and he's doing this by drilling a little hole in the shell and sticking a little plastic disc on them. These are provided by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and they help monitor movement of crabs and migrations around the eastern coast. Most of these horseshoe crabs originate from a population in Delaware Bay, and those crabs migrate up to New Jersey and down to Maryland. But this little group that's spawning here is obviously in the Maryland coastal ecosystem, but many of them originated life in the Delaware Bay ecosystem. This is an estimate of the numbers of horseshoe crabs seen in Maryland. And this is just, we have about 15 miles of coast and similar mileage of inland bays. So this is just a small portion of the coastwide numbers, but this is just Maryland. And what you can see here is that the numbers of crabs went up to about 2014, and then they started dropping off. That little island, Skimmer Island in Assawoman Bay there, there are a number of these islands, and they're disappearing. They stopped adding dredge spoil to them, and they're disappearing due to erosion and boat traffic. And as those little islands disappear, the spawning area for the horseshoe crabs is also disappearing, as well as the upland, the vegetated upland there, which is where lots of birds like to build their nests, especially terns and skimmers. So they stopped adding spoils to Skimmer Island in 2014, and then you can see that the numbers of horseshoe crabs in the bays started to decline after that. But this is just Maryland. This is not Delaware Bay. Horseshoe crabs are important ecologically for a number of reasons. They're bioturbators, which means they plow the seafloor. They turn over the sediment, which aerates it and helps recycle the carbon. They're predators of other fish, shellfish particularly, and invertebrates. They're hosts to symbiotic organisms on their shelves. They can live 27 years maximum, we think. Once they get to be adults, they're too big for most predators, except possibly sharks and sea turtles. But they're really important as a source of food for migrating shorebirds that eat the eggs that they lay in along the shoreline. One of those birds is the red knot. Every year, about 400,000 shorebirds visit Delaware Bay. And these birds come all the way up from Brazil every spring. Over 90% of the world population of red knots comes through Delaware Bay. And when they arrive, they only weigh about 100 grams, which is about 3.5 ounces. And while they stay there for a few weeks, feeding on horseshoe crabs, they can double their weight because the crab eggs provide them with all the fat that they need to complete their flight all the way up to the Arctic. And you might think that would put a big dent in the horseshoe crab population, but they're only consuming the eggs that are still left on the surface of the sand, like you see here, and in the very shallow parts of the sand. And that's less than 10% of the eggs that are laid. So they don't really impact the horseshoe crab population very much. Another way that we find that horseshoe crabs are important is as use for bait for conchs and eels. These are channeled whelks. There's a fishery for them, mostly up in Massachusetts and down through New Jersey and into Maryland a little bit, but mostly north of here. And the fishermen traditionally used horseshoe crabs as bait for these. I studied these things up in Massachusetts. There's a couple of different types of whelks. There's the channeled whelk, Busicotypus canaliculatus, which is fished with traps up in the northern parts of the coast and New England. And then there's the knobbed whelk, which are fished with dredges from Maryland and Virginia on south. And they use these to make a product up in New England that's very popular called scungili, which is basically a stew made with chopped conch. Now more and more of this product is shipped to Asia, and much of it is shipped live for the market over there. These conch are possibly overfished in some of their range. And so here's a picture showing the channeled whelk up there at the top and the knobbed whelk on the right side there. Up in Massachusetts, they use a trap like this. It's basically a wooden box with a hole in the top, and the conchs will climb up the side and fall into the top. This fellow on the right was a graduate student of mine, Bajan P. Moeller. And here the fisherman is using a horseshoe crab, which he cuts in half with a machete, and then he puts a half of the horseshoe crab in each pot. And they really like using the female horseshoe crabs because the eggs seem to attract the conchs better than the male horseshoe crabs do. So this was a major use for horseshoe crabs. There were millions of horseshoe crabs being harvested annually just to be used as bait for conch for a number of years. Oh, here we are with our conchs. Bajan himself, my graduate student, came from a family who fished for conchs down in Virginia. They fished for the knobbed whelks using this boat with dredges. And we would go out at night. I went out with him to do this and drag these dredges across the seafloor. And we'd drag for about a half an hour. I'd go down in the galley and fall asleep. And then he'd come down and kick me awake every half hour and I'd go out on the back deck and sort the catch. And along with the conchs we were catching, we were also catching a lot of horseshoe crabs. And at the end of the night of fishing, we had about 2 buckets full of conchs and about 5 buckets full of horseshoe crabs. So then Beijing would take these horseshoe crabs to a dealer and sell them, who would ship them north to Massachusetts and then sell them to the fishermen that we'd go out with, and he'd chop them up and use them for bait to catch the other kind of conch, the channel whelk. So it's kind of a circular ecosystem here, fishing for conchs, catching horseshoe crabs, sending the horseshoe crabs to another fisherman to help him catch conchs. Another really important use for horseshoe crabs is the production of something called Limulus amoebocyte lysate, or LAL. LAL is made from the blood of the horseshoe crab, and it is the best available substance for testing for the presence of endotoxins, which are produced by bacteria and can be present in medical equipment and drugs, and particularly vaccines, surgical utensils, and implants like artificial hips and things. So there's a company in Ocean City that was harvesting horseshoe crabs and using the blood and sending it off to labs to be converted to LAL. And the way they do this is they bring the crab into the lab and they try to keep them moist, because they're required to, they don't kill the crab, they just draw blood from it. They're required to release the crab back to the ocean. And so they want to keep the crab alive. So they're spraying it with cold seawater. And then they'll put the crab in these little harvesting racks, stick a large gauge needle through a crevice in the shell, literally right into the heart of the crab, and drain the blood out into these vials. And you can see the volume of blood they're getting from these crabs is well, it says 250 mils in that Pyrex volume. That's about a cup's worth of blood out of each of these. It turns out to be less than 50% of the blood volume. And then they will take the crab and put it back in the tote, and that evening take the crabs out on a boat and put them back in the ocean. Now, not all the crabs survive this process. And here they are with this is Dr. Tom Nowitzki, who was one of the pioneers of this process. Here he is holding a vial of the hemocyanin, which is the blood from the horseshoe crabs. And what they'll do is they will lyse it. They break the cells apart, and then they centrifuge it down, and the precipitate comes out of the bottom. You see it in the tubes on the left. That little bit is produced from that jar of blood. A jar of blood like that can produce about 7 grams of this lysate, which then can be used for tests. They only need about 1/10 of a milliliter of that stuff to test for the presence of bacterial endotoxins. Now, production of this stuff it's very valuable. It's about a $200 million business. And during the COVID pandemic, the need for testing vaccines increased the need for producing this stuff from horseshoe crab. I said that some of these animals don't survive this process, and a number of people have tried to estimate what the mortality is, and it can range from 5% to 30%, depending upon a number of conditions: how long that crab has been out of water, how it was handled, what size and sex the crab was, etc. The people who are managing horseshoe crabs look at all these different tests, and they sort of take a midpoint number of about 15%, and they use that in their calculations. The actual number is a secret that the industry keeps. We don't really know. But other things can happen, even for crabs that survive this process. Once they put them back, it may change their behavior. They may be disoriented. They may leave the spawning grounds that they were initially headed to. They may not participate in spawning. Tagging some of these crabs has shown that the crabs that are bled, once they're returned to the ocean, actually have higher survival than unbled crabs. And we don't know why, but one possibility is that the people were selecting healthy crabs for blood production to begin with. So they got the healthier crabs and left the old and diseased crabs out in the ocean. Another thing that happens is once these crabs are bled, they don't return to the beaches in as high a proportion as unbled crabs. So there's evidence that it's sort of preventing them from partaking in mating activities. Possibly once they had a needle stuck in their back, they decided they didn't want to be anywhere near the shoreline again for a while. There are some growing concerns about this industry. In addition to the American horseshoe crab, the limulus, the Asian horseshoe crab, Tachypleus, is also used for this process, and they produce a similar product, Tachypleus amoebocyte lysate, or TAL. And many of those are also eaten, so they don't get released. The market for this stuff in the US is about $200 million, and it increased during the coronavirus epidemic. So a lot of people are looking into trying to find a way to produce an artificial product that will replace the use of the real blood from the horseshoe crabs. And some substitutes have been found, predominantly one called recombinant factor C, which can be produced artificially. It has some potential. It's not yet been approved by the FDA in the United States, though it is being used in other countries. According to the scientists I've talked to, it's not quite as good. It doesn't quite have the specificity or the sensitivity of the horseshoe crab produced product, but I think they'll get there. So I'm hoping that in another 5 or 10 years, this industry of taking the horseshoe crab blood will sort of dissipate as we replace it with artificial product. As for the conch fishery, because the horseshoe crab fishing has been restricted, they're having to find other things to use for bait. Some people have tried developing artificial baits, but nothing's come along. Many people are using green crabs, which are invasive crabs in New England and on the East Coast and in many places. When I last went out on a conch fishing boat, the fellow was using a mixture of green crabs and shark heads that he was just pounding in the smithereens in a bag, and he hated it. It wasn't as good as the horseshoe crab bait, but the horseshoe crabs were becoming too scarce and too expensive for him. And we can't really cultivate horseshoe crabs. There are a number of other animals that we can cultivate, oysters, obviously. Some crabs can be cultivated. I've done a lot of work with aquaculture of king crabs, but horseshoe crabs aren't very easy to cultivate. They're large, they have a lot of space, they have really long lives, they don't become mature for 10 years. So replacing or augmenting the crab population through cultivation is not really an option at this point. The best option we have for conserving the horseshoe crab populations are really to improve the methods that we currently have for production of LAL and to replace it with artificial product. That's the best method. And of course, we want to conserve them because they're really valuable as a food source for birds. Now, I mentioned the Delaware Bay population is the source for most of the horseshoe crabs that are caught in Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. All the crabs caught for bait are killed because they're used for bait. The ones used for LAL production are released, but a portion of them die, maybe even 15% or so. And there's also other crabs may be killed when they're caught by other fisheries, other trawl fisheries for flounder or scallops. They catch crabs and they throw them back, and some of those die. Many of them die. The Delaware Bay population is actually doing pretty well. The last estimate of population showed that there were about 16 million females. That's the green line over on the right side, and about 40 million males. So it looks fairly healthy, recovering from what it had been 10 years ago before they started putting restrictions on the bait fishery. The crabs are managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission, ASMFC. They use what's called an adaptive resource management, or ARM framework, which looks at crab numbers as well as shorebird numbers, and estimates the number of crabs that can be removed without impacting the shorebirds or the crab population. Potentially, they estimate they could remove as many as 140,000 female crabs from that population. But the harvest that's been approved for 2025 is limited to 500,000 males and 0 females. And this has been largely due to pressure from advocates for the bird populations, who pressured them not to allow harvests of female crabs. Not all of the horseshoe crabs caught along the East Coast originate from Delaware Bay, though. So there are other harvests of about 85,000 horseshoe crabs in Maryland and 20,000 males in Virginia. But for now, they've stopped harvesting female horseshoe crabs. This is the harvest of crabs historically for the last 20 years. You can see back around 1998, there were 2.5 to 3 million crabs being harvested every year just for bait, and those were all being killed. More recently, it's been less than 1 million. The latest figures are in 2022 or 2023, about 570,000 were caught for bait. Those were all killed. About 700,000 were taken for biomedical use, of which about 110,000 were estimated to die. So still about 1 million crabs being removed from that population. But you can see now that the medical use, the yellow bar, is much more valuable than the bait use, and more crabs being taken for medical use than for bait. So the question is, does the management of horseshoe crabs provide adequate protection for shorebirds? We know climate change is going to affect egg deposition. Loss of these little islands reduces the habitat for the crabs. Increasing sea level will reduce habitat for the crabs. Warming seawater may affect the timing or the quality of the egg deposition. Horseshoe crab abundance is improving in the past 20 years, but it's still only about 20% of the historic high levels. The red knot numbers in 2020 were the lowest seen in 20 years. So their populations are suffering. I had a chat with Dr. David Curson, who is a director of bird conservation in Maryland for the Mid-Atlantic Division of the National Audubon Society a few years ago. And he said, and I quote, "The ecotourism industry employs more people than the conch fishery and is probably more valuable. It makes no sense to use such a valuable resource, the horseshoe crabs, for bait to catch conch that are shipped halfway around the world." And I did a little back of the envelope economic calculation, trying to estimate what's a horseshoe crab worth. So it's really impossible to estimate the value of ecotourism. We're going to take how many people to the Eastern Shore, 20, 30, 40, I don't know, people to the Eastern Shore. And you're going to go over there, you're going to buy dinner, you're going to buy gas, probably. You may stop in some other store and buy tchotchkes and knickknacks. There's a value to the ecotourism to come see the birds and the horseshoe crabs. That, I don't know what it is. I don't know how to estimate it. But if we just look at the fishery value, in the 10-year period from 2011 to 2020, NOAA recorded a little less than 1 million pounds of channeled whelks being caught. Channeled whelks require bait, and they were worth about $7.1 million at the dock. And during that time, about 500,000 horseshoe crabs were harvested from Delaware Bay annually for that purpose, for bait. So if we look at those two numbers, we could say, well, each of those crabs, if put to use for catching conchs, caught about 2.1 pounds of conch, which was worth about $16.24. So one crab possibly worth $16 in terms of conch catch. The Lao industry harvested 500,000 crabs annually, maybe killed 80,000. We don't know about the Tachypleus numbers. If the US industry was worth $100 million, then each horseshoe crab bled was worth about $200, and each dead one over $1,000. So it's pretty easy to say that the horseshoe crabs are worth a lot more to the pharmaceutical industry than to the fishing industry. But that's just economic value. That doesn't tell us how valuable they are to the bird populations and what those removals would mean to them. A few questions to wrap up this talk. Horseshoe crabs are organisms that have been around for 200 million years, essentially unchanged. And I think they easily qualify as a charismatic megafauna. So we need to think about what is the best use of this resource if we're going to use them. Is it a commodity for exploitation, or is it a critical component of the ecosystem? Should we be harvesting them at all for bait, for conchs, or for Lao production? Should we be increasing our research into alternative sources for bait and for Lao production? Should we enforce improved crab handling, try to reduce the mortality from 15 or 30% down to minimal values? Should we prioritize egg production? Should that be the first priority use for these animals? Not for our use, but for the birds. Should we be harvesting any horseshoe crabs at all? Or will the horseshoe crab eventually go the way of the whaling fleets as we transition to an alternative resource completely? Those are just some questions to think about when you go out and look at these things. So this was a different year, but on the previous trip, we went out, this was a couple of years ago, to look for the horseshoe crabs. Mostly what you're seeing on the beach there is seaweed, but there's a few crabs in there. This is Slaughter Beach. We'll go there and we'll see the crabs coming ashore. That was a full moon. We're going on the new moon. Our date is Monday the 26th, and the tide will be high about 9:17 p.m. And that's when we'll see the horseshoe crabs coming out of the water, and they'll be pooling on the beach for an hour or two afterwards, but that's a prime time to see them. I'm sure you've all been given directions to the place. Slaughter Beach is just east of Milford on the coast of Delaware there. And you've all got directions how to get there. Here's a little overview. There's a firehouse here with a big parking lot on the shore side. and then access to the beach. And all we have to do is literally walk down to the beach and we will see our horseshoe crabs right there. And these are some previous numbers of horseshoe crabs counted by biologists in Delaware. This is in 2022. And on that Memorial Day weekend, May 30th, was their highest counts on the new moon. So I'm pretty positive that we'll see some good numbers of horseshoe crabs on our trip. Just to wrap up, some sources, if you want to see more information about horseshoe crabs: the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's horseshoecrab.org and iNaturalist. All of these have excellent websites on horseshoe crabs. As my last slide, I just want to mention that I write weekly or bi-monthly column on Substack called Ecologist at Large. You can find me at just typing ecologistatlarge.substack.com. I write articles about ecology, marine science. I wrote 2 lengthy articles about horseshoe crabs back in 2023. One was called Tied Up in Knots, and one was called What's a Crab Worth? You can go back and find those articles. I'm working on several on oysters right now that'll come out in the next few weeks, but hope you'll take a look at that. And that's the end of my story.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. And you can unshare, come back. I think I still have a spotlight on you.
There we go.
And we'll open it up to questions. There's a couple of questions that were written earlier. Kay asked about the tag that's used to track the horseshoe crabs. Don't they come off when they molt and shed their exoskeletons?
That's a good question, and I don't have the answer for it. But what I think they're doing is they're tagging mostly the large, older females, and either they've stopped molting at that point or they're not going to molt for several years. So they have a couple of years worth of opportunity to get that crab back. And will it kill the crab? I don't know, but I don't think so. I think they figured that out, but I'm not sure quite how. Now, so I saw another question somebody put up there earlier. How many days do they spawn? I know the Delaware people count them 3 days in a row: the day before the full or new moon, the day of the moon, and the day after. And so they're there for 3 days at least. And I'd say possibly an additional day or 2 on each end. So maybe 3 to 5 days. And then there was another question. What was that one?
Well, is it always at dark, at night?
Yes. They don't come up during the daylight high tide. So for instance, there'll be a high tide at 9 or 10 at night. That's when they'll come out. They don't come out during that morning high tide.
I can answer a question about the tagging, because I used to do it as a volunteer. We only tagged the adults after they stopped the molt. So they would have been about 18 years old at the time.
Okay, great. I'm vindicated. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Thank you. Where in Maryland? I know that you've mentioned that we're going to slaughter, and you mentioned that little island. Where else in Maryland can they be seen? Is it only on the eastern shore, or is it also on the western shore?
I don't think they come into the bay. Maybe around Cape Charles, but I don't think they come up the bay because it's not saline enough. But there's another place that you can get to real easily. The name of it escapes me, but maybe we can collectively figure it out. There's it's in Delaware, and there's a little park on one of the inland bays on your way to, I want to say, it's south of Rehoboth Beach, just south of Indian River Inlet. there's a bay, I don't know, Indian River Inlet, and then there's a bay, and on the south side of that, there's a park with a public access beach, and that's one of the places I'm told that you can see horseshoe crabs real easily. I can't think of the name of the park, but maybe somebody can look it up.
All right, if anybody knows that, put it in there. Martha asks, does the timing of the egg laying line up well with the red knot arrivals this year?
Well, I don't know about the bird arrival yet, but I guess we're going to find out when we get there.
Okay. And Carrie wants to know, over what time period do bled crabs experience reduced spawning?
I'm sorry, say, do they experience what?
Over what time period do the bled crabs experience reduced spawning?
Well, so that was taken from the tag returns. And so people are out there tagging during the spawning period. And some of those tags, they might get back, a week later, 2 weeks later, a year later, 2 years later. And what they're finding is those crabs that are returning to the beaches, they're seeing fewer of them that had been from the bleeding industry than from non-bled. And I don't know if that was a targeted study, but it suggested, over several years that the crabs that were returning to beaches, they were missing some of those crabs that had been bled.
Dan is interested to know about prioritizing management goals. Is it reasonable to say we should be fishing for fewer conch in order to better manage horseshoe crab populations?
Well, we should definitely be fishing for fewer conchs in my book. The conchs are, I believe they've been overfished, and 10, 12 years ago, we published articles saying the size at maturity was above the size which they were catching. They were catching conchs below the size at maturity. And the state of Massachusetts looked at that and said, okay, we'll raise the size at maturity, or the minimum size for the fishery. And we said, well, if you do that, all of the bigger conchs are females. And if you do that, what's going to happen is you're just going to have a fishery that's just all the big females. This is the most important part of the spawning population. And that's exactly what happened. They raised the size limit, and then the fishermen started saying, well, the population's going down. All we're catching is females. It's a conundrum. I don't think that they're catching too many conchs necessarily, but I think the management needs to be enlightened. They need a different kind of management. It needs to be based not necessarily on size, but more on quotas, individual fishing quotas. I think that would improve management of it. And the horseshoe crab baits the bait fishery has been restricted so much that they're really looking at alternative baits now. So that's putting pressure on the conch fishing industry to improve their game as well. So I think it's coming from multiple angles.
I was curious, why do the horseshoe crabs as bait? Is that a traditional prey species for the whelks in the wild?
Good question. Conchs are attracted to live animals, mostly clams, that's their primary food. What is it that attracts them? The fishermen think it's the eggs or some substance in the eggs that is attractive to them. I don't know of any scientific studies that have looked at this in detail. It could be some fat product in the eggs, or the egg structure itself that attracts them, and whether or not females are actually more attractive to them than males is another question. I tried playing around with this in the laboratory once, but getting conchs to do anything in the laboratory was very slow. We couldn't get them to respond very well.
Gotcha. Well, that's very interesting. Alan,
I've got the name of the park. It's Holt's Landing State Park, and it is on the Indian River Bay near Bethany Beach. And you can go there, and that's one of the places that the Delaware people go to count crabs.
all right, add that to your list. Alan asks, the one graph with the numbers in recent years, do you know why there are more male versus female horseshoe crabs?
My guess is that those females are not maturing until they're 10, 12 years old, and there's fewer of them on the beaches, whereas the males that are trying to mate with them may be younger. Certainly you look at them and they don't have as many barnacles and shells on their back. So probably you're looking at a population of 12 to 15-year-old females being mated by a population of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 younger males. So there's just more males in those size categories that are being seen on the beaches. And those numbers are based on beach counts. They're not based on how many are out in the ocean. If you went out and did some kind of estimation in the ocean, I think the numbers would probably not be so skewed.
Okay. Steve wants to know, let's see, horseshoe crabs are described as living fossils. What is the age of their oldest fossils, and how long ago did the extant species diverge from a common ancestor?
I don't have the details for that. I had a number there of 200 million years, which is, I think, the estimate of how long that the current species has been around. But I don't know any more about it than that, honestly. Sorry.
All right, we're going to have. Yeah, absolutely. Do the pharmaceutical companies that are bleeding the horseshoe crabs, do they do any mitigation in terms of habitat restoration or funding for conservation efforts for horseshoe crabs to account for their mortality rates?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer, but I don't really think so. There's at least 2 companies in Salisbury that are doing that. I was working with Martin Fish Company. We were actually developing a grant proposal to study the mortality from their operation. They were right on the dock in Ocean City, and they were trying to get those animals back in the water within 24 hours of capture, which I think would be unique in that industry. I don't think anybody else is getting them returned that fast. We never did get the funding for it, so we didn't pursue it. But I don't think they were required by the government to pay anything for a license to do that or to mitigate the impact of removing those crabs. As far as I know, there's no program that requires them to do that.
Maybe they should. I don't know.
Maybe they should. Yeah, you'd think they would. If they want to keep that industry going, you'd think they'd want to put some money into conservation. Now, I can't speak for other companies, but I know that they weren't doing it.
I have a question also about climate change and habitat. If these go back for 200 million years, I'm sure that little barrier islands have come and gone, and sea level has risen and fallen, especially with different glacial periods. And so if as the sea level rises, are there any thoughts about where these populations of horseshoe crabs might go to find their next spawning areas?
Well, I think sea level rise is one thing that's happening, but another thing that's happening is that as the ocean warms, many populations of animals are moving towards the poles. There's a polar shift that's happening. And this is happening on land, birds, as well as in the ocean. And Delaware Bay is a prime habitat for this. The sand is right and the beaches are nice and long and flat. If these populations of crabs start moving north, then they're going to find some more habitat in New Jersey, for instance, and maybe Long Island. But once if they get up into New England, they're not going to find that kind of habitat up there. So that's, I think, a bigger risk to them from climate change. That plus the possibility of warming temperatures changing the pattern of spawning. It might cause them to spawn earlier in the year, which might not be the right time. It might not coincide with the tides properly. There's any number of things that can happen. Ocean acidification can affect the development of the eggs in the water. As far as the bird populations are concerned, they've evolved to come to Delaware Bay at the same time that the horseshoe crabs are spawning. So if the horseshoe crab spawning time changed, that would have a big impact on the birds. Shifting populations to the north, the birds would probably follow them for a few centuries, but the timing issue is critical for them.
Steve asks, are there specific immunity-related genes that allow horseshoe crabs to identify and defend against invading pathogens? And are there other adaptive strategies that have developed in horseshoe crabs that gave them advantages to surviving in marine environments for such a long time?
Wow, that was a loaded question, and I'm not sure I got all of it. Could you read it back to me slowly?
Sure. Are there
Can I read it in the chat window? Is it in the chat window? Oh, there it is. Okay, let me look at that. Are there specific immunity horseshoe crabs that defend against invading pathogens? Oh, well, I can't speak to genes, but the reason that this LAL industry developed is that crustaceans, and they're not crustaceans, but they're sort of in a parallel phylum up there, spiders, xerostomes. They don't have very good immune responses, but they do have these cells, the amoebocytes, in their blood that react to the presence of bacteria. They're actually reacting to a molecule on the shell, the exterior of the bacterium. And that was discovered by accident in a laboratory in Woods Hole, where they put some blood somehow got mixed in on a petri dish or something with some bacteria and showed that it reacted, it clotted. And the clotting reaction is how the crab sort of isolates that pathogen and gets rid of it. But it also is a visual signal that there's an endotoxin present. Now, there's some genes, obviously, that are controlling that process. I don't know what they are. I'm not a geneticist, but it's a very simple sort of immune system. It just creates a blood clotting reaction, and that's really all it does. It doesn't trigger any of the kind of immune responses that mammals have. And the other part was adapt the strategies that gave an advantage surviving in marine environments for a long time. Well, they aren't very edible, so we haven't eaten them. And if you look at a horseshoe crab, it's not something that a fish could eat very easily. So they don't have very many predators, and there's large numbers of, there's lots of coastal beaches. So they just kind of are in a niche where they've been able to adapt and live and not succumb to predation or overexploitation for a long time, until we came along. And now you see what's happening.
So I misunderstood you. I thought you said in your talk that there were some people who were eating horseshoe crabs. That's not correct.
Oh, yes, that's true. They do eat them in Asia, I should say. But they weren't eaten in, sort of Western Atlantic, Northern European populations. They weren't eaten there, but they're eaten in Asia. So yeah, you're right about that. And they're having trouble over there. I know their populations are declining. So yeah, they survived for a long time until humans got a hold of them.
When they are mating, do the females have any control in choosing to release eggs for a specific male that they feel is going to be more, advantageous or not?
That's a great question. And that would be a wonderful master's degree study for somebody to find out what control the females have in these mating. The amplexus is what it's called when those crabs come together. And I would not be surprised if the female does have some choice in the matter, either rejecting males that might be too small, or that would be one method of avoiding them. Other crabs do those things, and there are other things that go on. There's all kinds of assortative mating in crab population. And again, these are not crabs. They look kind of like crabs. They have some behaviors associated with crabs, and I know mostly about crabs, so I'm going to tell you about crabs. In most crab populations, there's lots of choices going on in matings. Males rank females according to their reproductive status. If the female has mated before at all, if she's mated before in the season, if she's mated and then molted, if she hasn't molted yet, if she's mated with multiple males, there's all sorts of factors that go into how the male chooses the female. And the females will also reject males that are too small for them. We know this from other crab populations. I would not be surprised if horseshoe crabs do the same thing. It would be a great study for somebody.
All right, somebody get on that right now. Maybe it's how strong they are holding on to with their belly pads. Okay, any other questions out there? You can also raise your hand and I can call on you if you want to ask Dr. Stevens directly. Anybody? Oh, Alan, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Stevens. I came in just a little late, but I'm going to assume maybe you didn't talk about how you got interested in this type of work in the first place, if you remember kind of what sparked your interest in doing this.
When I was 4 years old, I was on a beach in North Carolina and a crab bit me on the toe, pinched me on the toe. And I've been bitten with marine biology ever since. That's my story. I became a scuba diver when I was 13 in a rock quarry in Ohio, and then went diving in Florida when I was 15, and I was hooked. I said, this is what I want to do with my life. So got a bachelor's degree in biology in Ohio because it was cheap, easy to do. And then went to graduate school, first in South Carolina, got a degree in marine biology where I studied conchs, actually. And then I was looking for a job. I got a master's degree. I'm a young guy. I'm not married. I can go anywhere in the world. Where can I go that I can study coral reefs, drink margaritas on the beach with girls in bikinis? That was the ideal job, right? There weren't any jobs like that. But at that time, in the 70s, the government was hiring lots of people to study fisheries because around 1977, we declared a 200-mile economic zone around our coasts. Previously, it had been 12 miles. And there were boats from all countries, Russia, Japan, China, Korea, Poland, fishing right up to a few miles off the coast. We didn't know what they were catching. We didn't know what was out there. So all of a sudden, the government has decided, we now own 200 miles out. Let's put some people out there and find out. And there were jobs. So I thought, all right, if that's where the jobs are, I should study fisheries. So I went to the University of Washington in Seattle to get a degree in fisheries. And the first year I was there, I went out on those foreign fishing boats to find out what they were catching off the coast of Oregon. And they were catching pollock mostly, not pollock, hake, which is kind of like pollock, the thing in your McDonald's fish sandwich. And they were catching other kinds of fish, rockfish and salmon and other things. So I spent 2 months on those boats. And then looking for a PhD topic, I ran out of money. I dropped out of school and I got a job with the Washington Department of Fisheries, and they wanted me to look at the impacts of dredging channels, ship channels. What's the impact of dredging on crab populations, Dungeness crabs in the bays in coastal Washington state? And that's how I got into working with crabs. And I pretty much stuck with that for 30 years. I studied Dungeness crabs. I worked in Alaska for 22 years studying king crabs, snow crabs, tanner crabs. And then I came to the East Coast and did some work on conchs, and then started studying deep sea red crabs. I have not worked on blue crabs here because by the time I got to Maryland 15 years ago, I knew everybody in the blue crab research world, and I didn't want to step on their toes. So I said, well, what are they not studying? And there weren't many people studying stuff out in the ocean. So I went out in the ocean with my graduate students, and we studied deep sea red crabs and conchs and black sea bass. And we discovered that black sea bass were aggregating around outcrops with corals on. There's corals off the coast of Maryland. They grow 3 feet tall. They're orange branched things. And that's where the fish are. And fishermen go out there and fish on them with traps. And we put cameras on these traps, and we discovered as they're pulling the traps up, they drag the traps across the seafloor and they're breaking the corals. And then the fisherman would say, well, we used to fish that spot over there, but there's no fish left over there. So we fish over here now. And we're going, guess why? You've damaged the coral that the fish need as habitat. And we did a bunch of scuba diving, and we put cameras down. We literally went down to the bottom, set up tripods to allow the cameras to count fish. And then we saw that, okay, if they're damaging the corals, how long is the corals, what happens to them? Can they grow back? So then I had a student studying age and growth of corals, and we found that the corals can live 15, 20 years. But there was a whole about 5-year chunk that was missing. And it was like, okay, we got a bunch of corals that are 2 and 3 years old, and then a bunch that are 7 and 8 years old. There's about a 5-year span that's missing. What happened in that time period? And that was about the time period of Hurricane Sandy. So we think that big storms can have an impact on the coral habitat. And now I'm totally off on another subject. Did I do a talk on corals?
You did, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well, thanks for your life work and for tonight was great, but I love hearing kind of the evolution of the people that speak here, and that was quite a full, a full telling. Interesting.
I've exceeded my time limit here, I think.
Are any other questions for Dr. Stevens on this, on horseshoe crabs or anything? I look forward to hearing how everybody's trip goes for those of you who are heading out. Again, if there are some spots still available, so you can register if you want to head out this Monday to see the spawning in person. And
I'm really looking forward to it because I've been out to see the crabs, and this is a real. It's a wonder of. It's an environmental wonder to see this, to see these crabs come in and spawn. It's just not something that everybody can do, but it's easy to get to, and it's just an amazing thing. But I've never seen the red knots there on the shorelines feeding, so I'm really looking forward to that.
All right, I'm looking forward to seeing everybody's pictures posted on Facebook. So please sure to share that. And thank you, Dr. Stevens, for coming and spending your time and sharing your expertise with us tonight and on Monday for the tour. Everybody remember, no Mess Learn Thursday next week, but then we're learning about the Baltimore and Bullock's hybrid zone of the Orioles. So that should be very fascinating. Till then, stay well, stay curious, stay outside. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great show.